everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved serial killer case from Wales. In fact, this killer is actually believed to be the first ever documented Welsh serial killer, and he was dubbed the Saturday Night Strangler. In the early 1970s, 3 young women disappeared after they went on nights out, and sadly they would later be found murdered, and it would be almost 3 decades before their killer was actually identified. But unfortunately by that time it was too late for them to face justice. But quickly before we get into the case, I would like to say a huge thank you to Fabulous for kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Fabulous is the #1 self-care app designed to help you build better habits and achieve your goals. The Fabulous app has more than 30 million users from around the world, and it's not hard to see why. It's basically like your very own digital coach. Fabulous uses insights from behavioral science to make it easier for you to develop and actually stick to great and healthy habits. When I first heard about Fabulous, I just knew that it was the app for me. It was the app that I needed in my life because I obviously work for myself, I work from home, and because of that I've always struggled to kind of structure my day and stick to routines. I also sometimes struggle with productivity and staying focused, but I can honestly say that since using Fabulous, that has improved so much, because with Fabulous you can go at your own pace. There's no pressure, and they break down scientifically proven healthy habits into very small tasks so that you don't feel overwhelmed, because they are easily achieved every single day. Fabulous is 100% personalized, and you can choose between 2 different approaches. There's the habit tracking approach, where you can either pick from more than 100 healthy habits that you would like to include in your daily routine, or you can create your own, and Fabulous will help you stick to these habits by sending you reminders. Or alternatively, they have dedicated programs designed specifically to help you achieve your well-being goals. With this approach, you'll choose a journey that will immerse you into your very own personal adventure over several weeks. You'll be guided through the process with motivational letters to read, and your new habits will be added to your daily routine. I've been using Fabulous for a good few weeks now, and I've picked out habits that I want to include in my morning, afternoon and evening routines, and they are really starting to stick. I'm really consistent with them now. Some of my morning routine habits include drinking a glass of water as soon as I wake up, eating a great breakfast, and writing down my 3 most important tasks of the day. And I now feel like as soon as I've done those things, I'm ready to go, I'm ready to take on the day. I really couldn't recommend Fabulous enough. I think it's an incredible app. So if you would like to start developing better habits and start building your daily routine, then you need to be quick, because the first 100 people who click the link in my description box will get 25% off a Fabulous premium subscription. Once again, a massive thank you to Fabulous for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to you guys for always supporting the sponsors on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. So for this week's case, we are going back nearly 5 decades now to the year 1973 in Llandarcy, which is a village located in Neathport, Talbot County in South Wales. It was the morning of Sunday the 16th of September 1973 when 2 dead bodies were discovered by a member of the public who was walking in a woodland in Llandarcy not too far from the main road. The bodies found were that of 2 young women. They appeared to be two teenage girls, and eventually they were identified as being two friends, two best friends, Pauline Floyd and Geraldine Hughes, who were just 16 years old at the time. And they'd clearly been the targets of a very, very vicious and brutal attack. It was clear from looking at their bodies at the scene that these two young girls had been murdered. They were actually found with a ligature tied around their necks. They had rope around their necks which had been used to strangle them both to death. But in addition to that, they had also been badly beaten by their attacker. So they had blood on their clothing, and this had probably been done by the attacker in an attempt to control them and prevent them from trying to fight back. It was determined that both girls had also sadly been raped by the killer. However, they were found fully clothed, although they did have mud on the bottom of their feet. So what the police believed happened was that the killer forced them to take off their clothing. He then proceeded to rape them, and then he ordered them to put their clothes back on before he eventually strangled them to death. Now, the girls weren't actually found together, as in like right next to each other. One of the girls, I believe it was Pauline, she was found lying face down on the ground in one area of the woodland, and Geraldine was found lying on the ground just a couple of yards away, and she was actually rather close to the main road. So this suggested to the police that the girls were raped and murdered in that woodland, and that at some point during the attack, Geraldine must have escaped the attacker whilst he was killing Pauline, and she started running towards the main road, and she almost made it. She almost got away. However, unfortunately, he caught up to her, and when he did, he strangled her to death. So when their bodies were found that Sunday morning by that member of the public, the police were obviously contacted. Officers were dispatched to the scene, and a murder inquiry, a double murder inquiry, quickly began. But before we start talking about the investigation, let me just tell you a little bit more about Pauline Floyd and Geraldine Hughes and the kind of girls that they were. So as I said, both girls were very, very good friends. They used to attend the same school actually, so they had known each other for a long time. Geraldine was described as being a very bubbly, lovely young girl who was just so full of life. She loved to laugh and she loved music and to sing. In fact, her cousin said that Geraldine had this music player in her house, and one of her favourite things to do was just listen to different songs on this music player and sing them while she was holding a hairbrush up to her mouth. She would pretend it was a microphone. Pauline, on the other hand, was a little bit more quiet and shy than Geraldine, but she was also described as being just a nice and lovely person. She was very much into beauty and makeup and fashion. She loved clothes, and by 16 years old, the two girls were actually working at the same place. According to sources, they both had jobs at this factory, a sewing factory, where they earned £16 a week. So after their bodies were found and the double murder inquiry was launched, one of the very first things that the police obviously had to do was work out the girls' last known movements. Where were they? What had they been doing in the lead up to their deaths? Now, as we know, their bodies were found on the morning of Sunday the 16th of September 1973, and it was eventually determined that just the evening before this, so Saturday the 15th of September, Pauline and Geraldine were on a night out. They often went out on a Saturday night. It was something that they really enjoyed doing together. And on the night in question, they went to a club in Swansea called the Top Rank, one of the most popular nightclubs in the area. And then at the end of their night out, probably in the early hours of the morning, it's believed that they left the club and intended to hitchhike back home. They lived roughly 7 miles away from the club, and hitchhiking was something that, again, Pauline and Geraldine did regularly because they couldn't always afford to pay for a taxi home, so they would just thumb for a lift. Of course, today people are very aware of the dangers of hitchhiking. You rarely hear of people doing it now because we know the risks, but back then in the early 70s, hitchhiking was such a normal thing to do. So many people did it, and they didn't necessarily think that it was unsafe to do so. And that obviously included Geraldine and Pauline. They had hitchhiked so many times before and they'd always been fine. But on this particular night, they weren't fine. They never made it home. So the police theorized that at some point after they left the club that evening, they began hitchhiking and they were offered a lift home by their killer. However, that was clearly not his intention. He didn't intend to drop them home safely. He intended to rape and murder them, and that's exactly what he did. So after the police had pieced together Pauline and Geraldine's last steps, they started looking into suspects and potential people of interest. Only issue was they had a lot of people to look into. Obviously, they were going to look into the possibility that maybe the girls were killed by someone that they knew, but they were also very aware that the perpetrator could have been a complete stranger to them. And at the time, in 1973, there was a steelworks factory not too far from the crime scene in Port Talbot, which employed thousands and thousands of people. There was also a lot of construction work going on at the time in the area. So the police theorized that maybe the killer was one of the employees at the factory or a construction worker, and they travelled to the area for their job. There was also a fair going on at the time in the town of Neath in South Wales, which people often travelled down for. So there was the possibility that maybe the killer was someone that had come down for that and had already travelled back home. Or was the killer a local? Was it a member of the local community hiding in plain sight? As you would expect, the local community were absolutely terrified when the news broke that two teenage girls had been raped and brutally murdered. Everyone was so scared because a killer was on the loose, free to strike again if he wanted to. The police even warned the public, warned young women especially, not to hitchhike. They put up posters warning people not to phone for a lift because the risk was just too high. The police also appealed to the public following the murders because they were hoping that someone might come forward with some information. Perhaps there were witnesses. Unfortunately, no one had witnessed the actual murders. Obviously, the girls were killed in the middle of the night in that woodland, so it was probably pitch black. No one would have seen anything, and it's highly unlikely that anyone would have heard anything either, heard the girls scream, because they were in the woods in the middle of nowhere. So the police didn't receive any information from witnesses in terms of witnessing the actual crime taking place, but someone did come forward saying that they remembered seeing Pauline and Geraldine that night, and this is believed to be the last ever sighting of the girls alive. A member of the public came forward saying that he was driving in his car that evening, the evening that the girls went to the Top Rank nightclub in Swansea, and he saw Pauline and Geraldine standing near a bus stop just a couple of hundred yards away from the club. So this was obviously after they had left the club. He saw them standing near a bus stop, and then all of a sudden a car pulled up alongside them and Pauline and Geraldine got inside the vehicle, and then they weren't seen again after that. They weren't seen again until the next morning when their bodies were found. The man who witnessed this unfortunately said that he didn't really get a good look at the person who was driving the car. He knew it was a man, he could see that it was a man, but he wasn't really able to describe what he looked like. However, he did recall the car that he was driving, the one that the girls got into. He said that it was white and that he believed it was an Austin 1100, similar to the picture on screen. And the police also received information from another member of the public who said that they also saw a white Austin 1100 car parked up in a lay-by later that night close to the woods where the girls' bodies were found. So now the police had their first big lead in the case, the car. They were confident from these witness statements that the killer was someone that drove a white Austin 1100 and that he spotted the girls that night leaving the nightclub and offered them a lift home, but instead he murdered them. So this was a big development in the case. However, at the time in the early 70s, Austin 1100s were a very popular car. A lot of people had them. The police had a long list of everyone in the area and surrounding areas that owned this kind of vehicle which they were going to have to go through. And obviously because it was such a long list, this was going to take time. But they did it. They tracked the owners down, they got in contact with them and interviewed them. They asked them questions about their whereabouts on the evening that the girls were killed, where their car was that night, were they driving in it, etc, etc. And as well as all of this, the police and scientists were also searching the cars to see if they could find any evidence in there that related to this case. Now, of course, back then in 1973, DNA and forensic technology just was not a thing yet. So unfortunately, scientists wouldn't have been able to detect any traces of the girls' DNA in these cars. If they, for example, found blood in any of these vehicles, they wouldn't have been able to get a DNA profile from it to determine who it had come from. So all they could do was to try and see if they could find any fibers. They had the clothes that the girls had been wearing that night, so they wanted to see if they could find fibers from their clothing in any of these Austin 1100 cars. So many fiber tapings were taken. However, unfortunately, they had no luck. They couldn't concretely link any of these cars to the crime. So the investigation continued, but sadly, as time went on, it really started to slow down. They were following up on tips and leads. They were taking statements and questioning people. They were tracking down all of these Austin 1100s, but nothing seemed to bring them any closer to positively identifying the man that murdered Pauline Floyd and Geraldine Hughes. And as the months went by, this double murder inquiry started to go cold. And it remained cold for years and years and years until around 1998-1999, so about 26 years after this crime took place. You see, in the late 90s, the South Wales police decided that there was going to be a review into some of the unsolved crimes that had taken place there, crimes that had been unsolved for such a long time. Because by this point, by the late 90s, obviously DNA and forensic technology had come such a long way, and they were hopeful that maybe now, using these advancements in forensic science, they might be able to finally solve some of these cold cases. And one of the cases that they decided to review was this one, the double murders of Pauline and Geraldine. Now, all of the evidence that was collected in the case back in 1973 had been kept in storage all these years. The police never got rid of any of it, just in case it could have proved useful later on down the line. So they still had crime scene evidence, the girls' clothing, they still had tapings and samples that were taken from their bodies. So this evidence was taken back out of storage in the late 90s, and it was sent off to be tested using the new technology that was now available. And luckily, they did find something on the girls' clothing. They found semen stains from where they had both been raped by the killer. So tests were carried out on these semen stains, and they were able to obtain DNA from it, the killer's DNA. So this was an absolutely huge breakthrough in the investigation. However, the case developed even further because the police were actually able to match this DNA to another unsolved case from South Wales, which also happened in 1973, proving that the double murders of Pauline and Geraldine wasn't the only crime that this killer committed. The DNA of Pauline and Geraldine's murderer matched DNA that was obtained in the case of a 15-year-old girl named Sandra Newton. Just 2 months before the murders of Pauline and Geraldine, on Saturday the 14th of July 1973, Sandra Newton just completely disappeared after being on a night out. She was at a nightclub that night in a town called Britton Ferry in South Wales, and after she left the club, it's believed that she, just like Pauline and Geraldine, would have tried to hitchhike home. However, she never made it there. She just never returned home. And just a couple of days later, Sandra was found dead. Her body was found just dumped in a ditch in a remote location in Tomwar in Neathport Talbot, and she had been murdered. She had been raped and then strangled to death, again just like Pauline and Geraldine. But with Sandra, the killer actually used her own skirt to strangle her. The cases were so incredibly alike. There were so many similarities between them. The cases happened just 2 months apart. All 3 girls disappeared after being on a night out on a Saturday night, and all 3 victims had been raped and their cause of death was strangulation. And yet, very, very surprisingly, despite these similarities, the South Wales police didn't actually connect them at the time. I don't really know how they missed it, but yeah, from what I can gather, at the time they never looked into the possibility that they could have been linked and committed by the same person. And unfortunately, over the years, Sandra's case also started to go cold. It remained unsolved. The police always believed that Sandra's killer lived nearby. They believed that they were a local just because of the location where her body was found in that ditch. You had to have known the area to know that it was there, kind of thing. So they strongly believed that the murderer was a local man, but they just never figured out who it was. And then in the late 90s, when the South Wales police began that review into cold cases, Sandra's murder was one of the cases that they decided to kind of reopen alongside the cases of Pauline Floyd and Geraldine Hughes. And that's when the connection was finally made. The police were able to obtain DNA of Sandra's killer, I believe also from traces of his semen from where Sandra had been raped. And when tested, it was found that Sandra's killer's DNA was a match to the DNA of Pauline and Geraldine's killer. So Pauline and Geraldine were not this killer's first victim. He murdered Sandra before he murdered them. This was an experienced killer, a serial killer who by this point had been given the nickname the Saturday Night Strangler by the media, obviously because his method of murder was strangulation and because he seemed to abduct and kill his victims on a Saturday night. Now, by the time that the match was made and by the time the police had obtained the killer's DNA, the UK's national DNA database had been established. It was set up in 1995. So the police entered the killer's DNA profile onto the database in the hopes that a match would come up, but sadly, there was nothing. The killer's DNA was not on there. So that was a setback in the investigation. However, eventually, I believe it was just a couple of years later, the police team decided to use a new technique called familial DNA testing to see if that could get them any closer to identifying the perpetrator. They were basically going to search the DNA database for anyone on there who may have been a relative of the killer. So maybe like a sibling of the killer or a child, because obviously their DNA profile is going to be very, very similar to the killer's. So they started doing that, and in the meantime, other police officers dug out all of the old police files into the cases from the early 70s, and they basically decided to just go through it all with a fresh pair of eyes. They were going to go through everything again, all of the statements they had taken, all of the previous suspects and people of interest that were looked into all those years ago. They actually decided that they were going to try and track down all of these old suspects to see if they could get a DNA sample from them, because obviously back then when they were suspects in the original investigation, the police didn't have the DNA techniques to definitively rule a person out as being the killer. But by this point, by the early 2000s, they did. So the police were going to try and get in contact with these old suspects and try to get their DNA sample to compare against the murderer's DNA. However, of course, this was like nearly 3 decades later, so tracking them all down was going to be difficult, and as you would expect, a lot of them were no longer around. They had passed away. But they took samples from people that they could find, and then these samples were sent off for comparison. Meanwhile, the familial DNA testing was still going on, and eventually the police had a hit. They found someone on the database who had a very similar DNA profile to that of the killer. It was a man named Paul Kappen, and his DNA was on the database because he had been involved with the police before, I believe because of theft. He was a well-known car thief. Now, Paul couldn't have been the killer himself because it turns out that he would have only been around like 7 years old at the time of the murders. However, his DNA was about 50% similar as the killer's, indicating, of course, that the killer may have been one of his parents, his father. Paul's father was a man named Joseph Kappen, and at the time of the murders, he actually worked as a bouncer in Port Talbot in Wales, which I thought was very interesting. He worked as a bouncer, and the victims in this case all disappeared after leaving a nightclub. Let's just quickly talk a bit more about his background actually. So Joseph Kappen was born in October of 1941, I believe in Port Talbot actually, so he had lived there all his life. He had a very big family. He was one of 7 children, although he was brought up by his stepfather because his parents got divorced when he was still a young child. I couldn't really find much information about what his childhood was actually like, whether he had a good upbringing or a bad one. However, I do know that when he was just 12 years old, he started committing crimes. At first, he was just committing, I guess, smaller crimes such as petty theft. However, eventually, as his confidence grew, this started to step up. And as he got older, he started carrying out burglaries. He would steal cars, just like his son Paul would later go on to do. He was a very violent man. He was arrested for assault, and he was caught for many of these crimes that he was committing. He was arrested and convicted, and he was constantly in and out of prison. And when he wasn't in prison, he was working as either a truck or a bus driver or a bouncer, like I said. In the early 1960s, when he was in his early 20s, Joseph met a woman named Christine, who would go on to become his wife and the mother of his children. I think they had 2 children together. They may have had more, but I only came across information about 2 online. They had a daughter and a son, the son obviously being Paul Kappen. However, according to sources, Joseph treated his wife Christine awfully, so awfully. He was violent and physically abusive towards her. He also sexually abused her. He raped her on a number of occasions. And he also just wasn't faithful to her. He was known to constantly flirt with other women and pursue other women, mainly teenagers, teenage girls, and this is a fully grown adult man. In fact, around 1983, so when he would have been in his early 40s, he started dating a 16-year-old girl named Teresa, and he was violent towards her. One day after they had an argument, Teresa described how she slapped Joseph Kappen, and as soon as she did this, he grabbed her by the neck. He put his hands around her throat and he pushed her up against a telephone pole. It's also stated on one source that a couple of these young girls that he tried to pursue, he attempted to rape. So all in all, a very, very vile man, Joseph Kappen. Now, interestingly, Joseph Kappen was actually a person of interest in the beginning of this whole case. Back in the early 70s, when Pauline and Geraldine were killed, he was one of the many, many men that were looked into, mainly because he owned a white Austin 1100 car at the time. The exact same car that witness saw Pauline and Geraldine getting into that night. So at the time, officers went to go and speak with him. They asked him a couple of questions, and they asked him about his Austin 1100. Had he been out in it on the night that the girls were murdered? And he said no, he hadn't. He actually said that his car was not roadworthy at the time. There was something wrong with it that meant that it couldn't be on the road. And I don't know if the police ever checked that was actually true, but regardless, they had no solid evidence at the time to prove that he was the killer, and so they never really looked into him any further. That was that. However, of course, years and years later, nearly more than 3 decades later, in the early 2000s, Joseph Kappen's name popped up again. And as we discussed, this was because after running familial DNA tests on the DNA database, his son, Paul Kappen, had flagged up because his DNA was incredibly similar to the DNA profile the police had of the killer, the man who killed Pauline Floyd, Geraldine Hughes, and also Sandra Newton. So after having this huge breakthrough, the police knew that they had to find Joseph Kappen. They had to find him and get his DNA to see if it really was a match, to see if he was the serial killer that they had been looking for decades now. So they found out his address, they went to his house, they knocked on the door, and a woman answered. This woman was actually Joseph's wife. I don't know if it was Christine or if he had a second wife, but his wife answered, and so the police told her why they were there and that they needed to speak to her husband, Joseph Kappen. However, his wife replied saying that Joseph was dead, and he had been dead for more than 10 years by this point. Joseph Kappen died in June of 1990 from lung cancer. He was around 48 years old at the time. So that was, of course, a massive setback in the case, and because their now main suspect was dead, the police asked Kappen's children if they could take some DNA samples from them to test against the DNA of the killer, and they agreed. So their samples were taken and further tests were carried out. They were comparing his children's DNA to DNA that was found on the evidence, so like the victim's clothing. But apparently the results of those tests were inconclusive for some reason, and so instead the police decided that they were going to approach the Home Secretary and ask if they could have permission to exhume Joseph Kappen's remains. They wanted to exhume his remains, try and get some DNA from his body, and then use that to test against the DNA of the killer to see if it was indeed a definitive match. Luckily, the Home Secretary said yes, they gave permission for the police to do that, and so in May of 2002, that's exactly what they did. They went to the cemetery in South Wales where he was buried. They put up tents around his grave, and eventually their exhumation began. And what's so creepy and so chilling is that the people that were there that day, the people that were part of this whole operation and were actually digging up Joseph Kappen's grave, said that when they first started digging, when the shovel went into the ground for the very first time, all of a sudden there was this big loud clap of thunder just completely out of nowhere. It was just so strange, and the people there at the time just felt so weird about it. They actually felt as though that clap of thunder happened because they were, quote, unearthing evil. Following the exhumation, Joseph Kappen's body was taken to a mortuary, and DNA samples were taken from his teeth, his jawbone, and his femur, and then these samples were sent off for testing, and just a couple of days later the results were in. The results revealed that Joseph Kappen's DNA was in fact an exact match to the DNA of the killer. Joseph Kappen was the Saturday Night Strangler. He was the one who abducted, raped, and strangled Pauline Floyd, Geraldine Hughes, and Sandra Newton all those years ago in 1973. After approximately 30 years, this case had finally been solved. And this case was actually the very first in the world where familial DNA testing had been used to identify a serial killer after they were already dead. So this was a huge deal for forensic science, as I'm sure you can imagine. Finally, the families and friends of the victims in this case had answers. They finally knew the identity of the monster that did this to the three girls. Of course, because Joseph Kappen is dead, we don't know the exact sequence of events, what exactly happened those fateful nights in July and September of 1973, but we know that he abducted Sandra and he abducted Pauline and Geraldine sometime after they left the nightclubs. He probably saw them hitchhiking and thumbing for a lift, and so he offered them a ride home, but instead he did what he did to them. He killed them and then just ditched their bodies. It's just horrible that Joseph Kappen died before he faced justice for what he did. He never had to answer for himself. He never went to prison for the murders. He passed away before he was identified, which must have just been so painful for the families. It breaks my heart that they only they only really got some form of closure. They never got full closure because they didn't get to see the killer face punishment. But that is it for this case. A sad note to end on, but that is the case of the Saturday Night Strangler, the first documented Welsh serial killer, Joseph Kappen. Let me know in the comments what you think about this case. I would be interested to hear whether you think Kappen may have had even more victims, because if you think about it, he was never caught. So what was to stop him from murdering again? Personally, I think because his crimes were clearly sexually motivated, it is very, very likely that he did kill more people, and either their bodies have just never been found or he's just not been linked to them yet. So definitely let me know your thoughts and opinions on that. I really want to hear what you guys think. Also, let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can let me know in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box of my videos. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye!